They say that Russia's war on Ukraine started without provocation in 2022. That's not entirely true. Stick around, because in the next few minutes, you will understand the true cause and build-up of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But how does NATO come into the picture? NATO was formed in 1949, right after World War II, and its creation had one main purpose: contain the Soviet Union. It was created as a collective defense pact. If one member was attacked, all members would consider it an attack against them. That's Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. The idea was simple: deter the Soviets from attacking Western Europe by guaranteeing US military support. But the Soviets didn't sit quietly. In 1955, after West Germany was allowed to join NATO, the Soviet Union created its own NATO. They called it the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of the Eastern Bloc. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and others. On paper, it was collective defense, just like NATO. But in reality, it was kind of like Moscow's chain to keep its satellite states from breaking away and joining NATO. And any time one tried, like Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, Warsaw Pact tanks will roll in and, to keep them in check. For many years, Europe lived under this standoff. NATO in the west, Warsaw Pact in the east, two armed camps staring at each other across the world map. But then, on the 9th of November 1989, everything started collapsing due to a massive protest in eastern Germany that led to the destruction of the Berlin Wall, a heavily fortified physical barrier built by East Germany in 1961 to prevent its citizens from fleeing to West Germany, symbolizing the Cold War's division of Germany and Europe. Few years after that, in 1991, the Soviets' economy started breaking down. Uprisings were spreading through Eastern Europe, but the Soviets no longer had the strength or will to send in tanks to, as usual, keep them in check. One by one, its Warsaw Pact allies slipped away, leading to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Here's the interesting part. NATO was still functioning while the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. In Moscow's eyes, that meant that the playing field was no longer balanced. As the Cold War was ending, Germany is trying to negotiate its reunification, and at the table of negotiation, the US Secretary of State James Baker, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev are seated. Baker tells Gorbachev, "If you allow a unified Germany to join NATO, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward." But here's the fine print. Nothing was written down. Russia translated that statement as a guarantee that NATO would stay put and won't expand further eastwards. But Washington was not thinking that way. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Boris Yeltsin takes power in Russia. His country is in chaos. Inflation is out of control, state assets are being looted by oligarchs, and the military is in decline. At first, Yeltsin tried to look west. He floated the idea of Russia one day joining NATO. But the response from Washington and Brussels was a polite dismissal. Russia could be a partner, yes, but not a member. Moscow saw this as proof that NATO's purpose was not just partnership, it was to fight against the Soviets. But if the Soviet Union has collapsed, why is NATO still functioning? Meanwhile, members of the collapsed Warsaw Pact were now making friends with NATO. Poland's Lech Walesa, Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, and Hungary's Arpad Goncs all push for NATO membership. They argue that only NATO can protect them from ever returning to Moscow's influence. In 1997, NATO invites the 3 countries to join. 3 years later, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic officially becomes NATO members. Yeltsin, the president of Russia at that time, was not having it at all. He calls it a betrayal of the not 1 inch eastward agreement. But he couldn't do anything about it because Russia was too weak to resist. Putin at that time was a rising figure in Russian politics. Surely he was taking note of all of these events. Then, on December 31st, 1999, Boris Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, naming Putin, the then Prime Minister, as acting President of Russia. At first, Putin didn't come in breathing fire at the West and NATO. In fact, after the 9/11 terrorist attack in America, he offered to share intelligence and as well future cooperation and partnership with Washington. But then, NATO expanded again in 2004, swallowing up 7 more countries: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria. Moving NATO closer to Russia's doorstep, Putin's tone towards the West changed at that moment. He warned that the West had broken its promises. Russia has no intention of entering into a new Cold War, he said, but we will not allow anyone to trample on our interests. Putin saw this as a gradual encirclement of Russia and a threat to the security of the Russian Federation. From the perspective of the new NATO members, joining NATO wasn't aggression towards Russia. It was for their survival. However, this expansion placed an alliance that had once been Russia's sworn enemy directly on Russia's borders, inside lands that were once ruled by Moscow. To put it in perspective, if Mexico or Canada joined a military pact led by Russia or China, Washington would never tolerate it, just like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But yet the US insisted, this is not about Russia, this is about freedom and democracy. But to Russia, those words were all lies. By 2008, tensions were already high. Russia had endured 2 waves of NATO expansion, 1999 and 2004, and the Kremlin felt its red lines were being ignored. But what came next pushed those lines to the edge. NATO leaders gathered in Bucharest to discuss whether Ukraine and Georgia should be invited to join NATO. President George Bush strongly supported it. He argued that both countries had chosen the democratic path and deserved protection from Russia. But Germany's Angela Merkel and France's Nicolas Sarkozy objected. They feared this move would provoke the Russians unnecessarily. Though the move was strange and dangerous, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO in the future, but gave them no timeline and no immediate invitation. In other words, NATO made a promise without the security guarantee to back it up. Russia saw this as a loaded gun aimed at its throat. Putin decided to deliver a warning to the West. He attended the Bucharest summit himself, and in a private conversation, he argued that Ukraine was an artificial state, not a fully sovereign country in his eyes. He stated that much of Ukraine's territory was historically Russian land that had been given to Ukraine during Soviet times. If NATO tried to bring Ukraine or Georgia into the alliance, Russia would consider it a direct threat. This was not diplomatic language. It was a red line drawn in sand. August 2008. Just 4 months later, the line was tested. Fighting broke out in Georgia over the separatist regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Georgia's president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was fiercely pro-Western and had been lobbying hard for NATO membership, ordered his troops to retake South Ossetia, but as the Georgian troops tried to retake the region, Russian tanks rolled deep into Georgian territory, and the Georgian army collapsed within days. By the end of the war, Russia recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, effectively tearing chunks of Georgia away. The message to NATO was clear. If you continue expanding closer to our borders, we will roll out tanks and set everything ablaze. With Georgia out of the way, Ukraine became the next stage in the struggle between NATO and Russia. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine declared independence and adopted a position of non-alignment, meaning it didn't want to fully join NATO or fall back under Moscow's control. It sought to balance between the West and Russia, trading with both, cooperating with both, and avoiding picking sides. But that balance never lasted long. In 2004, the Orange Revolution brought a pro-Western government, Viktor Yushchenko, to power. He immediately started pushing for NATO and EU integration of Ukraine. Then came Viktor Yanukovych in 2010, friendly to Moscow. He won the presidency, and shortly after taking office, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law proposed by Yanukovych that formally removed NATO membership as a national goal. The law declared Ukraine a non-aligned state, meaning it would not join any military alliance, NATO included. Moscow was happy that Ukraine was staying neutral, but the real storm broke out in 2013. Ukraine's economy was shaking, and they had been negotiating an association agreement with the European Union. a deal that would deepen trade, investment, and political ties with Europe. To many Ukrainians, especially in the western part of the country, this was the first step toward Europe and away from Moscow's influence. But at the last moment, Yanukovych refused to sign the agreement. Instead, he accepted a massive financial bailout from Russia. That decision lit the fuse. Thousands of Ukrainians poured into Kyiv's Independence Square. They demanded Yanukovych reverse course. They waved EU flags, chanting, "For Europe, for Europe." As winter set in, the protests grew larger, angrier, and more defiant. The standoff lasted months. Security forces cracked down violently on protesters, leading to dozens of deaths. By February 2014, the protests escalated into a full-scale uprising. Armed clashes broke out in Kyiv. Yanukovych fled the country, and a new pro-Western interim government took over. But Russia didn't see this as the People's Revolution. They saw it as a coup backed by the West. Russian officials openly accused the US of orchestrating events behind the scenes. Leaked phone calls between American diplomats, like Victoria Nuland, discussing who should join the new government, only fueled and affirmed Moscow's claims. Within weeks of Yanukovych's fall, Putin made his move. Little green men, armed soldiers without insignia, appeared across Crimea. They seized airports, ports, and government buildings, and a referendum was quickly organized, and the people of Crimea voted overwhelmingly to join Russia. Then, on March 18, 2014, Russia formally annexed Crimea. Meanwhile, unrest spread into eastern Ukraine. Pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence. Backed by Russian weapons and volunteers, they launched an armed rebellion against Kyiv. The fighting in eastern Ukraine escalated into a grinding war. 2 attempts were made to freeze the conflict. Minsk I, 2014, brokered by the OSCE. It called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and autonomy for the separatist regions. It collapsed within weeks. Minsk II, 2015, negotiated by Germany and France with Putin and Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko. It again promised autonomy for Donbas and a ceasefire. But both sides accused the other of violations, and the deal never truly worked. The Donbas remained a frozen conflict, not peace, not war. While Ukraine itself didn't join NATO, the alliance kept growing. 2017, Montenegro joined. 2020, North Macedonia followed. More significantly, NATO began deepening ties with Ukraine itself. We are talking about joint military exercises, sales of Western weapons in large quantities, and US and UK training Ukrainian forces. Moscow saw this as NATO membership through the back door. Let's not forget that as all this was unfolding, Putin poured Russian oil and gas money into rebuilding the Russian military. We are talking new tanks, precision missiles, and many more. Some of these weapons were tested in the war in Syria in 2015. Russia was no longer the weak power of the Yeltsin years. Now let's come back to the story. In 2019, comedian turned politician Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president. He campaigned on peace but quickly changed his stance after he won the elections. 1 year later, 2020, Ukraine officially made NATO membership a constitutional goal again. The Kremlin was pissed off about this. It was their final confirmation. Ukraine was not returning to neutrality. By 2021, Russian forces began massing near Ukraine's borders. At first, Western analysts thought it was a bluff, a way for Putin to extract concessions. What a mistake. By December 2021, US intelligence was warning of a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia demanded, NATO must never admit Ukraine. NATO must roll back its forces from Eastern Europe. But the West refused. On a peaceful morning of February 24, 2022, Russian missiles struck across Ukraine. Columns of tanks rolled toward Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol, and Putin went on television to declare a special military operation. For many watching, it seemed sudden. But as you've seen, this was not sudden at all. It had been building for decades. 1990, a promise never written down about not 1 inch eastward. 1999 and 2004, NATO's first big expansions into former Soviet space. 2008, Georgia's war after NATO dangled membership. 2010, 2014, Ukraine swinging between neutrality and westward ambitions, ending with an uprising. 2014, Crimea annexed, Donbas ignited. 2015-2021, failed peace, NATO training and arming Ukraine, Russia rebuilding its army. By 2022, Ukraine started rolling with NATO in everything, and Moscow was like, "Not this time, my boy." Then they invaded.